rather early to report to the office. Very well, then I'll leave you now so I can unpack you out of bed. Would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land. We don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in proceedings, do we? She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out the room and closed the door. Now the fact that his landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy at the least. After all, she not only was harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost his sign in the war or something like that, and never gotten over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little Dutchman was sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderful, warm, and cozy. I'm a lucky fellow, he thought, rubbing his hands. This is a bit all right. He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There was only 2 other entries above his on the page, and as one always does with the guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was a George W. Temple from Bristol. That's funny, he thought suddenly. Christopher Mulholland rings a bell. Now, where on earth have I heard that rather unusual name before? Was it a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men? Perhaps. Or a friend of his father's? No. It wasn't any of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland. 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. George W. Temple. 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. George Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Such charming boys, the voice behind him answered. And he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her, rather high up, as though the tray was a pair of rings and a frisky horse. They sound somehow familiar, he said. They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that odd? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers, footballers, or something like that. Famous, she said, setting the tea on the tray down to lay the table in front of the sofa. Oh no, I don't think they were famous, but they were incredibly handsome. Both of them, I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you. Once more, Bailey glanced down at the book. Look there, he said, noticing the dates. This last entry is over 2 years old. It is? Yes, indeed, and Christopher Mulholland is nearly a year before that. More than 3 years ago. Dear me, she said, shaking her head and having a dainty little sigh. I would never have thought it. How time does fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins? It's Weaver, Billy said. Weaver. Oh, of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly me. Do apologize. In one ear and out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something, Billy said. Something that's really quite extraordinary about this? No, I don't. No, dear, I don't. Well, you see, both of these names, Mulholland and Temple, I not only seem to remember them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in the same particular way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as they were both famous for some same sort of thing, if you see what I mean. Like Dempsey and Tooney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt. How amusing, she said, but come over here now, dear, and sit down beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and ginger biscuit. Before you go to bed, you really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano watching her as she fussed about with the teacups and saucers. He noticed she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. Almost positive in the newspapers I saw them. Bailey said, I think of it in a second. I'm sure I will. There is nothing more tantalizing than a thing like that lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. Now wait a minute, he said. Wait just a minute. Mulholland, Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on walking tour through the West Country, and then all of a sudden... Milk, she said. Sugar? Yes, please. And all of a sudden, Eton schoolboy? Oh no, not my dear. The cast can't possibly be right. My Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy. When he came to me, he was a Cambridge undergraduate come over here now. Sit next to me. Warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Come on. Your tea's all ready for you. She patted the empty place beside her and saw Billy and waited for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. There we are, she said. How nice and cozy this is, isn't it? Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke, but Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned toward him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again, he caught a whiff of a particular smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not the least unpleasant, and it reminded him, well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts, new leather, or is it corridors of a hospital at a length. She said Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea. Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as the sweet Mr. Mulholland. Suppose he lived a fairly recent. Billy said he was still puzzling his head about how two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers. The headlines left, she said, arching her brows. But my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're both on the 4th floor, both of them together. Billy set his cup down slowly on the table and started hesitantly to smile back at him, and then she put one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. How old are you, my dear? She asked. 17, she cried. Oh, it's the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was. His teeth weren't white. You have full teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that? You're not as good as they look, Billy said. They've got simply masses of fillings in them in the back. Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older, she said, ignoring his remark. He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed it if you wouldn't have told me. Never in my whole life was there a blemish on his body. A what? Billy said. His skin was just like a baby's. There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea. Then he set it down again gently in a saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him in the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. That parrot, he said at last. You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window. You could have sworn it was alive. Alas, no longer. It's terribly clever the way it's been done, he said. It doesn't look like in the least bit dead. Who did it? I did. You did? Of course, she said. And you have met my little Basil as well. She nodded toward the institution, curled up comfortably in the front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time just been silent and motionless as the parrot. He put his hand, touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold. When he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish black and dry and perfectly preserved. Good gracious me, he said. Absolutely fascinating. He turned away from the dog and started admiration of the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must be most awfully difficult to do a thing like that. Not in the least, she said. I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea? No, thank you, Billy said. The tea tasted faintly bitter of almonds, and he didn't much care for it. You did sign the book, didn't you? Oh yes, that's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I could always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple, Billy said. Georgie Temple, excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except for them in the last 2 years? Her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up to him and said, the corners of her eyes, and gave him another gently smile. No, my dear, she said, only you.